with Chapter 3 of David McCullough's book, 1776. And you're going to notice that the way this is recording that it may stop in terms of the video, but the audio should continue, and really that's all that's important. Chapter 3, entitled Dorchester Heights, picks up where we left off in Chapter 2. The scene, of course, is in Boston, and McCullough describes and talks about the importance of a location in the southern part of Boston called Dorchester Heights, which is going to become the focus of this chapter, thus its title. Just argues that if the British would have occupied Dorchester Heights, that they very likely would have defeated Washington's army at Boston and very likely would have won this war. But for kind of unexplained reasons, other than General Howe not very aggressive, the British never decided to occupy Dorchester Heights. Ultimately, the Americans are going to occupy that key location, so he's going to unpack that. A couple of key British players here at Boston that need to be laid out for you. One, as I mentioned, is William Howe, the overall commander of the British Army throughout the course of this book. He'll eventually be relieved of command, but McCullough discusses him quite a bit. Was he a bad general, a good general? Basic way to understand Howe is that he was fairly tentative because he didn't think the Patriots were going to last, that this rebellion would collapse. So why spill a lot of British blood? Be tentative, just wait Washington out, and the war will end. That strategy does not work very well. William Howe had a brother by the name of Richard Howe, who was the key British admiral during the American Revolution, will become key in the events that we talk about in future chapters as the fighting developed in New York. Another key British person that you need to be familiar with was second in command in the Army to William Howe, and that's a man by the name of Henry Clinton. And McCullough, I think, quite capably makes the argument that if Clinton's argument and position would have been followed a little bit more, that the British very likely would have won this war. But Clinton and Howe do not get along very well. So you have that scene of the British command there in Boston. Then McCullough in part 1 here moves on and talks about Washington's situation early in 1776. As I mentioned in the last chapter, very concerned. Lack of supplies, no gunpowder, enlistments are only a year long, and many of the men are deserting. Washington would kind of ease himself by writing letters back home about repairs that he was having done at Mount Vernon to kind of relieve the tension there. Washington did receive assurances from the Continental Congress that he was in complete command, so he had their support, or at least he thought that they did, but the situation was still tough. In January, matter of fact, on January 17th, I believe, Washington received word of just how bad the invasion in Canada had taken place, with the death of Montgomery, the injury of Arnold. So things are not looking very good. But here at the end of part 1 of chapter 3, a highlight is mentioned, which is going to kind of turn the tables of what's going to happen in Boston. And McCullough unpacks a very amazing and heroic story of Henry Knox, that bookseller that I told you a little bit about in chapter 2, who will undergo a tremendous midwinter march to Fort Ticonderoga up toward Lake Champlain in New York, fort that the Americans had managed to capture very early in the war. And Knox and his men, heroic efforts, are going to bring back cannons and mortars from Fort Ticonderoga using oxen and sleds to bring back this heavy artillery, 300 miles through snow. Good stuff, pretty good description on that. And when Knox arrives back in Boston, Washington is going to have some significant artillery, and ultimately the Patriots, as we're going to find out, are going to decide to put that artillery on Dorchester Heights. So that was pretty much what was talked about in part 1 of chapter 3. In part 2, it mentions now that Washington has these cannons what are they going to do? Are they going to try to bomb the British out of Boston and start attacking? Held a council of war, but again, they are hindered by the fact that they don't have gunpowder. So an all-out assault on Boston they thought would be foolish. Old Putt, the fellow I mentioned to you before, screamed out, "I have no powder, I have no powder." So what they decided to do is that they were going to occupy Dorchester Heights and see if they could create a situation where they might be able to drive the British out of Boston with a show of artillery on Dorchester Heights. So part 2 just unpacks the move, the preparation for the move up Dorchester Heights. They did it. They occupied Dorchester Heights in the middle of the night. It took just a single night to do that. They had prepared the batteries and the defenses, the barriers that would be on Dorchester Heights between them and the British below. They had prepared those beforehand. A very good description is given of that. And then protected by weather, a deep fog that descended on Dorchester Heights the evening that they occupied it. The British had no idea that they were doing that. The Patriots had launched an artillery attack into Boston kind of as a diversion. So the British wake up in the morning and see that Dorchester Heights had been occupied, and William Howe commented that the Patriots had done more in one night to fortify position than the British had done in several months. That's what part 2 of chapter 3 dealt with. Part 3 mentions the preparation which will lead to the ultimate evacuation of the British in Boston. They had ships stationed in Boston, but they couldn't get the angle of the cannons on the ship at a good enough angle to bombard the Americans on Dorchester Heights. So their sea power is not going to help them out any. They decided perhaps we're going to land an invasion at the foot of Dorchester Heights. The British had decided to do that. Howe probably really didn't want to, and he's bailed out by a storm, bad weather that prevents that. So the British basically decide to evacuate Boston, and McCullough gets into a description, quite a lengthy description in fact, about the struggles and travails of all of the loyalists as they're trying to flee Boston. It mentions the Fluker family, again related to Henry Knox, the famous patriot, married into a loyalist family there. But all these loyalists who had lived in Boston all of their lives, never thought that they were going to have to leave, are now trying to scurry and get material prepared so that they can move out of Boston. A smallpox epidemic, I think it hit some of them, so 500 of them are sent back into the city. And the British had ordered the people of Boston to destroy anything of value before that they left. So when the British evacuate Boston and Washington's troops move in, they're expecting to find a lot of devastation, but it wasn't nearly as bad as what they were expecting. And that's pretty much what Section 3 gets into. So the Americans are now able to occupy Boston, hoping to find a lot of provisions. They do find a lot of stuff, but you should know what they primarily needed was gunpowder. Don't find any gunpowder, so they're still going to be hindered by that. Also no beef, lack of food, lack of provisions, particularly in terms of beef to feed his army. And then finally, part 4 of chapter 3 mentions that the response of the British evacuation of Boston. Washington really for the first time begins to receive some notoriety in American newspapers and American word of mouth. The emphasis would have been on the British evacuation. Washington is admired and is given a medal by the Continental Congress. In England, even though the king still has support with news of the British evacuation of Boston, some of his support begins to erode just a little bit. This war's not supposed to take this long. Why hasn't Howe been more effective? So what you have at the end of chapter 3 is that the British have left Boston. They get on their ships, including some loyalists, and they set sail for Halifax, Nova Scotia. Now, eventually, the British are going to launch a major attack and invasion at New York, but first they go to Halifax. Washington's army, after briefly being able to rejoice of their capturing of Boston, realized that the next showdown is going to be at New York. So at the end of chapter 3, you see that the American army under the command of George Washington are now having to shift their thought to move south to defend New York City. And quite accurately, John Hancock, who of course will sign the Declaration of Independence, warns Washington and really all the Americans, the evacuation that the British had to make of Boston may just make them mad, and they may launch a very powerful invasion. And in fact, that is what happens. At the end of this section, George Washington mentioned the move toward independence. Again, the Declaration of Independence had not been signed yet. All of this fighting up to this point, America is still not independent. Washington does also mention the importance of a pamphlet written by Thomas Paine called Common Sense that had been spreading around through the colonies and had arrived in Boston, and many of the soldiers, perhaps all of them, had read it, and the important impact that that had on lifting morale and a push toward independence. So in conclusion, when we get to the end of chapter 3, the fighting at Boston is over. So part 1 of the book comes to an end, and the shift is going to move south toward New York, and part 2 of the book will pick up there in episode 4.